Hi everybody, and welcome to lesson 4.5, Fishing. The content in this video is aligned to the third edition of Environmental Science for AP and is aligned to CED Units 5.8 and 5.16. Here are our content objectives for this lesson. When humans use natural resources, they alter natural systems. Humans can mitigate their impact on land and water resources through sustainable use. At the end of this lesson, you should be able to explain the sustainable yield model, compare and contrast maximum and optimum sustainable yield, identify the different methods of fishing, compare and contrast methods of fishing, describe the causes of and problems related to overfishing, explain how aquaculture is done, and describe the benefits and drawbacks of aquaculture. All this leads us to answering our guiding question: how do we use aquatic resources? Before we begin talking about methods of fishing, it's important for us to understand how we determine what we fish and how we fish. This begins with the understanding of the kinds of fish that we are targeting, as well as the reproductive rate of that population. Most fish grow logistically, as is demonstrated by the graph on the right. Simplistically, the maximum sustainable yield, or MSY, is the point on the graph which is approximately half of the carrying capacity. Again, this is a simplification of the concept, but is enough to work with. We can take the logistic growth graph and modify it to determine our maximum sustainable yield curve. The MSY becomes the maximum of a parabola on the graph of fishing mortality versus yield. Then we can explore what occurs when we use a variety of fishing efforts to determine the best way to fish while still retaining enough of the population for future reproduction. There are 6 points of interest on a sustainable yield curve that are important. The moderately fished point indicates a state in which the rate of removal is far lower than the maximum yield. As we move further upward, utilizing more fishing practices, we get to what is known as intensively fished. Continuing higher, we reach what is known as the optimum sustainable yield, identified on this graph by the star. At this point, the needs of those fishing or gathering the resource are met, but it is done in such a way that creates a buffer or surplus. Then we reach the maximum sustainable yield, where reproduction and rate of fishing are at their maximum rate. Beyond this point, the rate of fishing will be higher than the amount of reproduction. We will reach the overfished and even depleted point of fishing. At this point, we have stepped into what is known as overfishing. Let's take a moment to compare the optimum sustainable yield and the maximum sustainable yield. The difference between these two is what is known as the precautionary principle. This states that a buffer or a purposeful surplus is more useful to maintain the fishing stock for the future than harvesting at the maximum sustainable rate currently. Let's discuss the different methods of fishing used today. Of course, it is important that we mention that there are still places in the world that use traditional fishing practices, such as netting, spearfishing, and pole. These are the practices that most people think of when they think of going fishing, particularly pole fishing. Our discussion here will focus around more industrial or large-scale fishing practices. We will discuss them in order of environmental damage, from most damaging to least damaging. One of the most common practices is known as bottom trawling, which uses a weighted net to drag the ocean floor to catch fish. The problem with this is that it can destroy seafloor areas such as coral reefs and kelp forests. This also has a high bycatch, or the capture of organisms that are not the targeted organism. Next comes long lining, which uses a net with baited lines hanging from the bottom. The net is often very small and serves as support for the buoys that keep it afloat. The fishing lines can be up to 80 miles long and often are associated with high levels of bycatch, particularly sea turtles who are attracted to the material that is used for the bait on the hook. Next comes drift net, which uses nets to capture fish by their gills. In the United States, the net can be as deep as 50 feet and run as long as 40 miles. However, in international waters, it is limited to 1.6 miles long. This can also cause a lot of bycatch in terms of organisms getting caught up or tangled in the net. Lastly, you have purse seining, which is a process that uses spotter planes that are able to see specific schools of fish. Then a boat or boats will release a net and will wrap it around the school of fish and cinch it closed. This helps to target a specific population. While bycatch is possible, it is much less likely in Persian methods than any of the others. There are multiple problems associated with overfishing. Remember that overfishing is the practice of fishing beyond the maximum sustainable yield. We've already encountered one of the larger problems of overfishing, bycatch. This is the act of catching an organism that is not the target of the fishing practice. Those practices that are well known to have high bycatch are that way because the organisms are caught up in nets or lines and often die before the line or net is drawn into the boat. Then the organisms are tossed back overboard or may be brought ashore if they are of any monetary value. Industrial fishing, those practices that we just discussed, can lead to depletion of the population, which occurs when there are fewer organisms remaining that are needed to support the fishing process. Extensive depletion can lead to either economic or gene extinction. Economic extinction occurs when it is more expensive to harvest the organism than it will bring in profit on the open market. Genetic extinction is when the gene pool of that particular species has been removed entirely. Overfishing, depletion, and genetic extinction can lead to what is known as a trophic cascade. This occurs when one organism is removed from the food web, and this removal has a ripple effect throughout the entire system. Some organisms may lose resources, and others may lose predators, both of which can lead to the collapse of a particular food web or an entire ecosystem. Additionally, waste material from the fishing process is sometimes left behind. Broken lines, nets, and buoys are sometimes left behind in the water. They can drift around for years as they are most likely made of plastic, which requires long periods of time to degrade through interaction with sunlight. This, however, leads to other problems associated with microplastics and other chemicals released into the water. How do we avoid overfishing? There are 4 major ways in which we can address this problem. The most environmentally appropriate way is to use the precautionary principle to more accurately estimate population size. This allows for the harvested level to be lower than the maximum reproduction rate, meaning that we are harvesting at the optimum sustainable yield. The other options are economically motivated. By utilizing non-transferable quotas, we can limit the amount of fish a particular ship or company can harvest in any given time period. By making them non-transferable, we can increase the available surplus. This means that if Company X does not reach their quota of harvesting for a month, they cannot sell the rest of their quota to Company Y, who has already met theirs. In addition to this, moratoriums, or bans on fishing, can be used in particular areas or for particular species. This works in concert with international bans, which can limit or prohibit fishing in areas of international waters. Lastly, we can work to reduce or eliminate government subsidies that are offered for fishing. When subsidies are offered, companies are more likely to overfish to increase their profit. Reducing or eliminating these subsidies make the survival of the fish population a more important factor, as their existence is the driving force of the fishing industry itself. Aquaculture is a practice that is used in place of industrial fishing, particularly for those species that are commonly used, such as tuna and tilapia. This process is also known as fish farming. Specifically, organisms are held in artificial ponds or in netted sections in their natural habitat. These organisms are allowed to reproduce as normal and are harvested when they meet an appropriate age or size range. However, one of the problems with this is that these organisms are often in very close quarters, like you see in the picture on the right. This can lead to disease, which is often treated with antibiotics. This can lead to antibiotic resistance. Additionally, as these large amounts of animals die, their decomposition adds nitrogen, carbon, and other limiting resources to the water. This can cause problems like eutrophication. If these pens are in natural habitats, these issues can infiltrate the water around them and adds to the impact of these compounds in the water. Additionally, fish may escape and breed with wild members of their species. This can be especially problematic if we've been using genetically modified organisms. Infected fish could also transmit diseases to the wild population. The following slide provides you with an opportunity to see how some of these ideas are connected together. Feel free to pause the video and explore the connections between these topics. Then, use the statements at the end to review.